a ruthless businessman, feared for his cold precision, collapses in the middle of a crowded bridge, surrounded by strangers who refuse to stop. Just as the world threatens to fade into darkness, a small hand tugs at his sleeve. It belongs to a little girl, too young to understand his wealth, his power, or his mistakes. Yet her bravery not only saves his life, but also shatters the walls he spent years building. What she asks for in return, however, shakes him to his very core, forcing him to confront everything he thought he knew about success, family, and redemption. Before we dive into this captivating story of transformation, resilience, and the unexpected bonds that change lives, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're moved by this story of compassion and hope, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more inspiring tales to come. The early morning sunlight poured through the towering glass windows of Ethan Crowe's luxurious penthouse, casting long streaks of light across the marble floors. From his lofty vantage point, the city below stretched out like a distant, bustling kingdom. But in his glass fortress high above, Ethan lived alone. His daily routine was a testament to precision. Everything in its place, not a single detail overlooked. He adjusted his tie in the bathroom mirror, the reflection staring back at him cold and polished. Ethan was a man who seemingly had it all: wealth, power, and prestige as the CEO of Crowe Industries, one of the most influential firms in the country. Yet beyond the pristine decor and accolades lining his walls, there was an unmistakable emptiness. His penthouse was immaculate, every surface spotless, but it mirrored his life, perfectly ordered yet devoid of warmth or connection. Bookmark. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Ethan stepped into his private elevator. The soft hum of the mechanism was the only sound accompanying him on the descent to his waiting car. As usual, the streets bustled with life, but the insulated silence of the luxury vehicle shielded him from the world outside. He arrived at the Crowe Industries headquarters, the towering steel building reflecting his own icy demeanor, ready to begin another meticulously planned day. Inside his vast corner office, Ethan sat behind a desk that was as much a symbol of power as it was a barrier. Michael Adler, a mid-level manager, stood nervously before him, clutching a thin stack of papers. "Mr. Crowe, I assure you, it's just a minor error," Michael stammered. "1 decimal point, it can be corrected immediately." Ethan didn't flinch. His gaze was sharp, his voice even sharper. "A decimal point that cost this company thousands, Mr. Adler. Pack your belongings. Security will escort you out." "But sir, my family—" Michael's voice broke, his hands trembling. "That's not my concern," Ethan interrupted without a shred of emotion, already turning his attention back to the screen. "Good day, Mr. Adler." The office door clicked shut, leaving Ethan in a silence broken only by the hum of his computer. By the afternoon, he was presiding over a board meeting in the sleek, glass-paneled conference room. The tension in the room was palpable as Amanda Lane, a junior executive with an ambitious glint in her eye, presented a proposal for a community outreach program. "It's a small percentage of our annual profits," Amanda explained, her voice faltering under Ethan's icy gaze. "But the positive impact on the community could be tremendous." Ethan didn't even let her finish. "This company isn't a charity, Miss Lane," he said, shutting his laptop with a definitive click. "We're here to make money, not friends." Proposal denied. Next item. Amanda gathered her papers with trembling hands, her face flushed with humiliation. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging awkward glances. Ethan didn't notice, or perhaps he chose not to. To him, disappointment and rejection were mere footnotes in the relentless march of business. That evening, Ethan made his obligatory appearance at the annual charity gala hosted by Crowe Industries. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel was dazzling, its crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across the polished floor. Ethan stood apart, a solitary figure in a sea of chatter and laughter. Investors and executives approached him, but their conversations were devoid of depth, profits, projections, and mergers. No one spoke of dreams or passions. Across the room, Amanda Lane mingled with a group of colleagues, her earlier embarrassment forgotten as they shared photos and jokes. Nearby, Michael Adler's replacement was already bonding with the team. Ethan tugged at his bow tie, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. The room was too warm, the air too thick. After a few requisite handshakes, he retreated to the cold silence of his penthouse. As the city sparkled below him like scattered stars, Ethan sat on his leather couch, his phone heavy in his hand. On the screen was a number he hadn't dialed in years. Rebecca Crowe, his younger sister. Their last conversation had been strained, filled with unspoken resentment. She'd invited him to visit their parents' grave on their anniversary, but he had declined, citing an important merger. Now his thumb hovered over the call button. 1 ring. 2. On the third, he hung up, the familiar knot of guilt tightening in his chest. The penthouse seemed emptier than ever, the only sound the faint hum of the city below. The next morning, Ethan was back in his office, immersed in acquisition reports. As the spreadsheets blurred together, his chest tightened briefly, and he attributed a mild discomfort to stress. He brushed it aside. There were more important matters, like dismantling the next small business to increase Crowe Industries' profit margins. In this solitary routine of power and wealth, Ethan Crowe remained untouchable. But life, as it would soon prove, had other plans for him. Ethan Crowe prided himself on control. Every aspect of his life was calculated and precise, from his diet to his business acquisitions. But as the days wore on, the mild discomfort in his chest began to resurface. Each time, he dismissed it as stress or overwork. What Ethan didn't realize was that he was hurtling toward a moment that would shatter the carefully constructed walls around his life. That afternoon, Ethan decided to break from his usual routine. He changed into his sleek, expensive running gear and left the cold confines of his penthouse for a jog. The streets buzzed with life as he made his way toward the Brooklyn Bridge, his steps rhythmic against the pavement. Children played in the nearby parks, their laughter blending with the city's ever-present hum. Street vendors called out cheerfully to passers-by, and the scent of fresh-baked goods drifted from a corner bakery. The vibrant energy of the city seemed like a world apart from Ethan's stark reality. He kept his eyes forward, unwilling to be drawn into the warmth around him. His feet carried him onto the bridge, the iconic arches towering against the cloudless sky. For a moment the sun glinted off the river below, and Ethan felt a rare flicker of peace. Then came the first twinge. At first, it felt like a cramp, a small ache spreading across his chest. Ethan slowed his pace, shaking off the discomfort. But with each step, the pain grew sharper, deeper, until it felt like a crushing weight pressing down on him. His breathing quickened, and the world around him blurred. He stumbled, clutching the bridge's railing for support. Sweat poured down his face as his knees buckled. Ethan collapsed onto the wooden planks, his vision narrowing to pinpricks of light. All around him, the city moved on, oblivious to the man struggling for air. Tourists passed by, engrossed in their selfies. Cyclists weaved around him without so much as a glance. Even joggers, one after another, simply altered their paths to avoid him. Ethan's voice came out in a strangled whisper, too weak to catch anyone's attention. For all his wealth and power, he was utterly alone. As his vision darkened, a small voice cut through the haze. "Sir? Are you okay?" Ethan blinked, his gaze settling on a little girl kneeling beside him. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, her bright brown eyes wide with concern. Her hair was pulled into 2 neat pigtails that bobbed as she leaned closer. "I'm Maya," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the chaos around her. "You don't look good." Ethan tried to respond, but the pain made speaking impossible. He managed only a faint groan, which seemed to spur Maya into action. "Don't worry," she said with determination. "I'll get help." Maya jumped to her feet, her tiny figure a blur of motion as she waved her arms and called out. "Help! Somebody! Please help! This man is sick." For a moment, no one stopped. People walked past, their lives too busy or their attention too fixed on their phones to notice the scene unfolding. But Maya didn't give up. She ran along the walkway, her voice rising above the din of the city. Finally, her persistence paid off. A couple paused, then a jogger, and soon a small group gathered around Ethan. Someone called 911, while others knelt beside him, trying to make him comfortable. "The ambulance is coming," Maya reassured him, returning to his side. She took his hand, her small fingers curling around his in a gesture so natural it startled him. "You'll be okay." Ethan's chest still burned, but something about Maya's presence cut through the fear. He held on to her voice, her warmth, as the crowd around them grew. Minutes later, the piercing wail of sirens filled the air. Paramedics rushed onto the bridge, their movements efficient as they assessed Ethan's condition. Even as they worked, Maya stayed close, her worried eyes never leaving his face. Just before they loaded him onto the stretcher, Ethan's eyes opened fully. Through the haze of pain, he saw Maya framed by the golden light of the setting sun. Her face, so small yet so filled with determination, etched itself into his memory. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he couldn't quite name, something that softened the edges of his meticulously ordered world. The last thing he saw as the paramedics wheeled him away was Maya's tiny hand waving goodbye. The steady beeping of medical equipment greeted Ethan as he slowly regained consciousness. The antiseptic smell of the hospital was sharp, and his body felt heavily drained. A doctor stood at his bedside, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Crowe," she began gently, "you've had a heart attack. It's fortunate someone found you when they did. A little girl named Maya Thompson likely saved your life." Maya. Her name hung in the air, stirring something deep within Ethan. He closed his eyes, the image of her small, determined face clear in his mind. He owed her his life, a debt he couldn't begin to understand, let alone repay. Ethan Crowe remained in his hospital bed, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors the only sound in the room. Dr. Clara Bennett, a no-nonsense but kind-hearted physician, stood at his bedside, reviewing his chart. "Mr. Crowe, you're stable now, but your condition was serious," she said, her tone professional but empathetic. "If that little girl hadn't acted so quickly, the outcome could have been far worse." Ethan's throat felt dry as he rasped, "Maya Thompson?" Dr. Bennett nodded. "Yes, Maya. She's quite remarkable. Most adults would have walked past, but that child knew what to do and refused to give up." The image of Maya's bright, worried eyes flashed in Ethan's mind. Her tiny hand had anchored him during his darkest moment, and now the weight of her actions pressed heavily on his chest, not with pain but with gratitude. "I need to thank her," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Later that afternoon, Ethan's assistant, Marcus Dean, entered the hospital room, tablet in hand and a concerned look on his face. "Good to see you awake, sir. What can I do for you?" "Find everything you can about Maya Thompson," Ethan instructed. "Her address, her family, anything. I need to meet her." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll get on it right away." As Marcus left, Ethan's longtime business partner, Victor Chase, strolled in. Victor's tailored suit and practiced smile didn't mask the calculating gleam in his eyes. He clapped Ethan on the shoulder with feigned warmth. "Ethan, my friend, you had us all worried. How soon do you think you'll be back at the office? The Andrews merger is moving forward, and the board is eager for your input." Ethan studied Victor for a long moment, noticing how his gaze flicked to the medical monitors as if assessing his worth. "Dr. Bennett says I'll make a full recovery," Ethan replied evenly, watching Victor closely. "Excellent." Victor exclaimed, his enthusiasm more for himself than for Ethan's health. "Though you might consider delegating more responsibilities for your health, of course." Ethan's mind wandered back to Maya, as Victor continued to ramble about board meetings and market shares. Her genuine concern and selflessness stood in stark contrast to Victor's transparent opportunism. For the first time, Ethan found himself questioning the company culture he had built, one that bred ambition over compassion. A few days later, Marcus arrived with the information Ethan had requested. "She lives in Queens," he explained, handing over a neatly compiled file. "The Thompsons. It's a single mother, Hannah, raising Maya on her own. They live in a modest apartment building. It's, well, not exactly the kind of place you'd expect a hero to come from." Ethan ignored the comment, focusing on the address in front of him. Later that afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up outside a weathered apartment complex. Ethan stepped out, his sharp suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to the chipped bricks and graffiti-marked walls around him. The elevator was out of order, so Ethan climbed 4 flights of creaky stairs, his steps hesitant. He reached apartment 4B and paused, his hand hovering over the door. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals with ease, this simple act of knocking felt like an insurmountable challenge. Finally, he rapped on the door. It opened to reveal a woman in her early 30s. Her tired eyes held a quiet strength, her posture poised despite the wariness etched into her face. "Hannah Thompson?" Ethan asked, straightening his tie. Yes, she replied cautiously, her brow furrowed as she studied him. I'm Ethan Crowe, he began, his usually commanding voice uncharacteristically tentative. Your daughter Maya saved my life last week. I wanted to thank her properly. Before Hannah could respond, a small voice called from inside. Mommy. Who's at the door? Book Maya appeared, her face lighting up when she saw Ethan. You're okay, she exclaimed, rushing to his side. Yes, thanks to you, Ethan said, a small, genuine smile breaking through his usually stoic expression. Please come in, Hannah said, though her tone was wary. She stepped aside, allowing Ethan into their modest home. The apartment was small but clean, with worn furniture and curtains carefully mended. Children's drawings decorated the walls, their vibrant colors bringing life to the space. Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. This is a small token of my gratitude, he said, extending it to Hannah. Her eyes widened at the figure written on the check, but before she could speak, Maya tugged on Ethan's sleeve. I don't want money, Maya said firmly, her wide eyes meeting his. Can you spend a day with me instead? Like a friend? The request caught Ethan completely off guard. He blinked, still holding the check outstretched, as Maya continued to smile expectantly. Maya, honey, Mr. Crowe is a very busy man, Hannah said gently. We don't want to impose. But he has kind eyes, Maya insisted, her innocence cutting through the room's tension. And I think he needs a friend. Hannah studied Ethan carefully, her protective instincts battling with her daughter's hopeful plea. Mr. Crowe, she began hesitantly, while we appreciate your generosity. This is very unusual? Ethan finished for her, lowering the check. He looked at Maya's expectant face, then back at Hannah's cautious one. Something in him shifted. I'll do it. I'll spend the day with her. Maya's cheer echoed through the apartment as she bounced on her toes in excitement. Hannah looked at Ethan with a mixture of gratitude and concern, clearly uncertain of what to make of this wealthy stranger agreeing to her daughter's simple request. Ethan left the apartment that evening, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, an unfamiliar sense of purpose. Little did he know that a single day with Maya would change his life forever. The next morning, Ethan Crowe stood in front of his mirror, frowning at his reflection. He wasn't wearing his usual sharp suit or polished leather shoes. Instead, he dusted off a pair of dark jeans and a light blue sweater, clothes he hadn't touched in years. His assistant Marcus had raised an eyebrow when he'd seen the outfit earlier, but Ethan ignored the skepticism. Today was not a day for boardrooms or spreadsheets. When he arrived at the Thompsons' apartment, Maya flung the door open before he could knock. Mr. Crowe, she squealed, her eyes bright with excitement. You look so different, she giggled, pointing at his casual clothes. From behind her, Hannah appeared, holding back a small laugh. Good morning, Mr. Crowe. You clean up nicely, she said, amusement flickering in her eyes. Ethan cleared his throat, adjusting his sweater awkwardly. Good morning. I've prepared an itinerary for today, he said, pulling out a neatly printed list. First, we'll visit the Natural History Museum. Then, no. Maya interrupted, grabbing his hand before he could finish. I want to show you my neighborhood. There's a park, Mrs. Ramirez's flower shop, and the best ice cream place ever. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Hannah for approval. She shrugged with a smile. She tends to take charge. Before Ethan could protest, Maya tugged him out the door, her small hand gripping his firmly. Come on, Mr. Crowe. You'll love it. The first stop was a modest park a few blocks from their apartment. The iron gates creaked as Maya led Ethan through, her enthusiasm infectious. The air was filled with the sound of children's laughter, and Ethan found himself immersed in a world he hadn't visited in years. This is my favorite place, Maya declared, pulling him toward the swings where two kids waved energetically. That's Sarah and Tommy. Guys, this is Mr. Crowe. He's my new friend. Ethan blinked, unused to being introduced so informally. The children stared at him with wide eyes. Wow, are you really the man Maya saved? Tommy asked, awe in his voice. That's so cool. Sarah chimed in. Can you push me on the swing, Mr. Crowe? Ethan hesitated. He hadn't pushed anyone on a swing since he was a teenager watching his younger sister Rebecca. But Maya's expectant smile made it impossible to refuse. He stepped behind Sarah and gave her a gentle push, her delighted squeals filling the air. As the morning went on, Ethan found himself laughing, genuinely laughing, as he pushed both kids on the swings and watched them race each other across the playground. It was a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. Next, Maya led him to a cheerful storefront with flower boxes brimming with colorful blooms. The gold lettering on the window read Ramirez Flowers. "This is the best flower shop ever," Maya announced as she held the door open for Ethan. Inside, a woman in her 50s, Maria Ramirez, looked up from the counter and beamed. "Maya, my little sunshine," she exclaimed, stepping out to greet them. "And who is this?" "This is Mr. Crowe," Maya said proudly. "He's my new friend." Maria's warm smile widened. "Any friend of Maya's is family here." She turned to Ethan, giving him a quick once-over. "You look like you could use a little brightness in your life." Before Ethan could respond, Maria handed him a bouquet of daisies. "On the house," she said, her eyes twinkling. Ethan tried to decline, but Maria insisted. He finally accepted the flowers, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the simple, genuine gesture. Their next stop was the ice cream parlor Maya had promised. It was a small shop tucked into a side street, the kind of place Ethan had never noticed in his meticulously planned life. Maya ordered her favorite chocolate chip with rainbow sprinkles and convinced Ethan to try a scoop of strawberry. As they sat on a bench outside, Ethan listened as Maya chattered about her school, her friends, and her dreams. "I want to be a teacher when I grow up," Maya said, her face smeared with chocolate. "Mrs. Harper, my teacher, is the best. She makes learning fun, and I want to do that for kids too." Ethan nodded, struck by her earnestness. Her dreams were so simple, yet so meaningful, a stark contrast to the cutthroat ambitions he dealt with every day. "You know what, Mr. Crowe?" Maya said suddenly, looking up at him. "I think you needed a friend just as much as I did." Her words hit Ethan like a gentle wave, washing over years of walls he'd built to keep others out. For once, he didn't analyze or deflect. He simply sat there, enjoying a cone of strawberry ice cream with the most unlikely friend he'd ever made. By the time they returned to the Thompsons' apartment, the sun was beginning to set. Ethan felt an unfamiliar ache, not the kind that had landed him in the hospital, but one that came from realizing how empty his life had been. As they stepped inside, Hannah greeted them with a warm smile. "Looks like someone had fun today. Mama, Mr. Crowe pushed us on the swings, and we went to see Mrs. Ramirez, and he ate strawberry ice cream." Maya recounted excitedly. Ethan chuckled softly. "Your daughter is quite the tour guide." "Well, thank you for indulging her," Hannah said. Her tone was light, but her eyes betrayed a deeper gratitude. "It was eye-opening," Ethan admitted, his voice softer than usual. That evening, as he left their apartment, Ethan realized something had shifted within him. Maya's world, small, colorful, and full of heart, had shown him what his own world lacked. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd taken a step toward something meaningful. Little did he know, this day was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, connection, and himself. Ethan Crowe returned to his penthouse that evening, the city's lights sparkling through the towering glass windows. But tonight, the view felt different. It wasn't as mesmerizing as it used to be, nor did it provide the sense of control he'd always relied on. Instead, his home felt hollow, like an empty shell too big for one man. He set the daisies from Maria Ramirez on the counter, their cheerful yellow petals, a sharp contrast to the stark, monochrome decor of the penthouse. The smell of flowers lingered in the air, replacing the sterile scent of furniture polish. Ethan stared at them for a long moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth before he shook himself out of it. Bookmark. He sat down on his leather couch, flipping open his laptop. Emails from Victor Chase and the Crowe Industries board flooded his inbox, their tone increasingly urgent. The Andrews merger needed attention, financial discrepancies were under review, and several board members requested a meeting. But Ethan found himself unable to focus. Instead, he thought about Maya, her infectious laughter, her simple joy at sharing ice cream, and the way she had proudly shown him her favorite park. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples. A day in her world had stirred something inside him. A realization of how far removed he'd become from the kind of life that truly mattered. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office earlier than usual. He walked past the bustling reception area, his expression as guarded as ever. Inside his corner office, the trophies and framed magazine covers seemed to mock him. One headline read, "Ethan Crowe, Business Leader of the Year. His gaze drifted to the empty shelves where family photos should have been, a glaring reminder of the relationships he had sacrificed in pursuit of success. Midway through his coffee, a knock at the door broke his reverie. Marcus entered, carrying his tablet. "Sir, I have updates from the board," Marcus began. Ethan waved him off. "Later. What about the follow-up on Maya and her family?" Marcus hesitated, surprised by Ethan's shift in priorities, but quickly recovered. "Her mother, Hannah, works part-time at a local bakery and also cleans offices to make ends meet. It's not much, but they seem to manage." Ethan nodded, a tightness in his chest returning. "Anything else?" She's battling lupus," Marcus admitted reluctantly. "It's chronic and requires expensive treatments. From what I gathered, their medical bills are piling up." The news hit Ethan harder than he expected. He thought of Hannah's tired but kind eyes, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite her struggles. Then he thought of Maya, her boundless energy and unwavering optimism, completely unaware of the weight her mother carried. Later that afternoon, Ethan made his way to Crowe Industries' top-floor conference room for a scheduled meeting. The board members sat stiffly around the glass table, their unease palpable as Victor Chase, ever the opportunist, presented a glossy slideshow. "We've seen declining engagement in some of our markets," Victor explained, his tone polished but smug. "But the Andrews merger will streamline operations and cut losses significantly." Ethan leaned back in his chair, barely listening. His mind wandered back to Maria Ramirez's flower shop and the sense of warmth that radiated from her small business. He thought of Hannah working tirelessly, Maya dreaming of becoming a teacher, and the neighborhood he'd glimpsed, a community full of life and connection. "Ethan?" Victor's voice broke through his thoughts. "What?" Ethan snapped, sitting up straighter. "I was saying," Victor continued smoothly, "that your recent absences have raised concerns. The board wants reassurance that you're still committed to the company's success." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "The company's success is always my priority," he said evenly. "But I'd also like to remind the board that success isn't measured solely in profit margins." The room fell silent, his words hanging heavy in the air. Ethan had never questioned the bottom line before. Victor raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Interesting perspective," Victor said, his tone carefully neutral. "But we all know what the shareholders value most." Ethan said nothing, but inside, a storm was brewing. For years, he had prided himself on being the epitome of a corporate leader, but now, doubt crept in. The words Maya had said to him echoed in his mind. "I think you needed a friend just as much as I did." That evening, Ethan returned to the neighborhood he'd visited with Maya. He walked slowly, taking in the sights he had ignored on his previous trips. At a small grocery store, an elderly woman carefully counted coins to pay for her essentials. Across the street, a young man in a threadbare suit rushed to catch a bus, likely heading to his second job. Ethan's feet carried him back to the bakery Maya had raved about. Through the window, he saw Maria and her husband Carlos bustling behind the counter, their hands dusted with flour as they prepared pastries. Customers lined up, chatting warmly with one another. The aroma of fresh bread wafted into the street, and for a moment, Ethan stood frozen. He wasn't used to observing life this closely, life in all its messy, resilient glory. Here, people struggled, but found joy in the simplest things: a warm loaf of bread, a kind word from a neighbor, or the laughter of children playing outside. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, competitive world he'd created for himself. Back in his penthouse, Ethan poured himself a glass of water and stared out at the skyline. The city's endless lights flickered like tiny stars, but their brilliance seemed muted tonight. He picked up his phone and scrolled to a familiar name, Rebecca Crowe. His sister's number had been saved in his contacts for years, but he hadn't called her since their last argument. His thumb hovered over the call button, hesitation pulling at him. Finally he pressed it, one ring, two. On the third, her voicemail picked up. "Rebecca, it's Ethan," he began, his voice unsteady. I'm sorry. For everything. For not being there when you needed me. For thinking work mattered more than family." He paused, his chest tightening. "If you're willing, I'd like to try and make things right." As he hung up, Ethan sat back and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the man who had built a fortress of steel and glass around his life let a crack of vulnerability show. And in that crack, a new light began to shine. The following morning, Ethan Crowe found himself back in the neighborhood that had started to feel strangely familiar. The air was crisp with the scent of fresh bread wafting from the bakery, and the chatter of neighbors filled the street. Ethan walked with purpose, his expensive loafers clicking against the pavement as he carried a folder under his arm. When he stepped into the bakery, Maria Ramirez greeted him with her usual warmth. "Mr. Crowe, back for another croissant?" she teased, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron. Ethan offered a faint smile, but his expression quickly turned serious. "Maria, is Carlos around? I need to speak with both of you." Carlos appeared from the kitchen, his brow furrowed in concern. Ethan gestured for them to sit at one of the small wooden tables near the window. The morning sunlight streamed in, highlighting the worry etched into their faces. Ethan set the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of documents. "I've been looking into the rent increases on this block," he began. "Your landlord, Jonathan Pierce, has been systematically raising rents to levels that small businesses like yours can't sustain. I suspect it's part of a larger plan to push you out and redevelop the area for higher profits." Maria's hand flew to her mouth while Carlos's jaw tightened. "We've been struggling to keep up," Carlos admitted. "Every month, it gets harder." Ethan nodded, his tone resolute. "You're not alone. Several other businesses here are facing the same issue. But there's strength in numbers. If we organize and present a united front, we can challenge Pierce and negotiate fairer terms." Maria exchanged a hopeful glance with her husband. "Do you really think that could work? With the right strategy?" "Yes," Ethan assured them. "And I'm willing to help." Later that day, Ethan visited other businesses along the block, speaking with owners about their struggles. At the local library, Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the kind librarian who had been a fixture in the community for decades, explained how budget cuts and rising costs were threatening to close the library's doors. "This place is more than just books," Mrs. Harper said, her voice trembling. "It's where kids come to learn, where families gather. Losing it would tear the heart out of this neighborhood." At the youth center, Coach Paul Reynolds shared similar concerns. "We're barely keeping the basketball program running," he admitted, gesturing to the worn-out equipment. "These kids need a safe space to grow, but without funding, I don't know how much longer we can hold on." Ethan listened intently, noting every detail. The more he learned, the more determined he became to fight for this community. That evening, Ethan sat in his penthouse, the city lights sprawling below him. But instead of diving into corporate reports, he spread out maps, lease agreements, and notes he had taken from his meetings. Marcus arrived, carrying his laptop and a stack of additional documents. "You're serious about this," Marcus said, setting everything down. "Very," Ethan replied without looking up. "I've spent my career tearing apart communities like this one for profit. It's time to do something that actually matters." They worked late into the night, piecing together a strategy. By the time the city began to stir again, Ethan had drafted a plan to unite the neighborhood's businesses and residents under a single coalition. The next day, Ethan held a meeting in the bakery after closing hours. The small space was packed with business owners, residents, and even a few curious teenagers. Maria and Carlos served coffee and pastries as the group settled into makeshift seating. Ethan stood at the front, his usual corporate polish replaced by genuine conviction. "Pierce is counting on your fear and isolation to keep you from fighting back," he began, his voice steady. "But together, we represent a significant portion of this neighborhood's commerce. That gives us leverage. If we organize, we can demand better terms and hold him accountable." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Mrs. Harper nodded vigorously while Coach Reynolds leaned forward, his arms crossed as he listened intently. "We'll form the Brooklyn Bridge Business Coalition," Ethan continued, gesturing to Marcus, who distributed informational packets. "This isn't just about saving individual businesses. It's about preserving the character of this neighborhood and protecting the people who make it special." The crowd's initial skepticism began to melt away, replaced by a sense of hope. One by one, hands went up as people voiced their support. Over the next several weeks, the coalition came to life. The upstairs room of the bakery was transformed into a makeshift headquarters where Ethan and Marcus worked tirelessly. Maria and Carlos provided refreshments while local teenagers helped design posters and flyers. Maya, ever eager to pitch in, spent her afternoons handing out colorful leaflets she had decorated with hand-drawn hearts. "Save our neighborhood," she called out cheerfully, her pigtails bouncing as she darted from store to store. Ethan watched her with a mixture of amusement and admiration. Despite her small size, Maya had an enormous impact on everyone she met. "You've got quite the marketing expert there," Ethan remarked to Hannah one afternoon as they stood outside the bakery. "She believes in you," Hannah replied softly. "We all do." Her words sent a warmth through Ethan's chest that he hadn't felt in years. He glanced at Hannah, noting the color returning to her cheeks and the light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The coalition's efforts culminated in a meeting with Jonathan Pierce himself. The once intimidating landlord walked into the bakery expecting to intimidate individual tenants, but found himself facing a united front. Ethan stood at the head of the table, flanked by business owners and residents. "These lease terms violate state law," Ethan stated, sliding a folder of evidence across the table. "We're prepared to take legal action if necessary." Pierce's confident smirk faltered as he reviewed the documents. For the first time, he realized he was up against more than just a group of struggling tenants. As negotiations began, Ethan felt a sense of purpose, unlike anything he'd experienced in the boardroom. This wasn't about stock prices or market shares, it was about people. That evening, as Ethan walked back through the neighborhood, he noticed the small signs of change. The elderly woman at the grocery store smiled as she chatted with a young cashier. Children played hopscotch on the sidewalk, their laughter echoing against the buildings. And in the bakery window, Maya's handmade posters declared, "Together, we're stronger." For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was building something meaningful. Something that couldn't be measured in profits, but would endure far longer. While Ethan Crowe was busy rallying the Brooklyn Bridge Business Coalition, far away in the sleek offices of Crowe Industries, Victor Chase was setting his plans into motion. The boardroom, once Ethan's domain, now buzzed with whispers of discontent and manipulation. Victor paced behind his polished desk, his tie perfectly knotted, but his expression was anything but calm. "We need to act quickly," he said into his phone, his tone clipped. "Ethan's erratic behavior has been noted by the board. We've lost confidence in his leadership." On the other end, Jonathan Pierce smirked. "That's unfortunate," he replied with feigned sympathy. "But I'm sure you'll find a way to steer things back in the right direction." Victor hung up, turning his attention to a stack of doctored financial reports on his desk. Over the past few weeks, he had meticulously fabricated evidence to paint Ethan as negligent, even reckless in his decision-making. It was a gamble, but Victor knew how to play his cards. Meanwhile, Ethan and Marcus were hard at work in the bakery's makeshift headquarters. The coalition was gaining momentum, and the evidence against Pierce was growing stronger. Documents revealed predatory clauses in lease agreements, illegal rent hikes, and clear intent to push out small businesses in favor of large developments. "This is solid," Marcus said, spreading the evidence across the table. "We can take him down with this." Ethan nodded, but his attention drifted to the window where Maya was distributing flyers to passers-by. Her smile and enthusiasm were contagious, drawing people in with ease. "She's a natural," Ethan murmured. "She's got your determination," Marcus added with a grin. Ethan's response was interrupted by a knock on the door. Susan Dale, one of Crowe Industries' junior executives, stood nervously at the threshold. Her usually confident demeanor was replaced by a mix of guilt and anxiety. "Susan?" Ethan said, rising to his feet. "What are you doing here?" She stepped inside, clutching a USB drive. "I heard what Victor's been saying about you," she began, her voice trembling. "He's manipulating the board, Ethan, and I think you need to see this." Susan placed the USB drive on the table and took a deep breath. "These are the original files from the company's servers. Victor's been doctoring financial reports to make it look like you've mismanaged the company. I don't know how far he's willing to go, but I couldn't stay silent anymore." Ethan exchanged a look with Marcus before plugging the drive into a laptop. As they reviewed the files, the scale of Victor's deception became clear. Altered dates, inflated losses, and fabricated transactions are all designed to frame Ethan as an incompetent leader. "This is exactly what we need," Marcus said, his tone grim but determined. "Thank you, Susan," Ethan said sincerely. "This took courage." Susan nodded, though her hands shook. I hope it's enough." Across town, Victor was busy solidifying his grip on Crowe Industries. In a private meeting with key investors, he presented his case. "Ethan's recent behavior has been concerning," Victor said, sliding the falsified documents across the table. "These numbers don't lie. Our stock value has dropped, and his absence from crucial meetings is alarming." Margaret Liang, one of the firm's largest investors, frowned as she reviewed the reports. "If this is true, we can't afford to let Ethan stay in charge," she said. Victor leaned back in his chair, feigning regret. "I take no pleasure in this, but the board is preparing to vote on his removal as CEO. Your support would mean everything to the future of this company." Back in the neighborhood, Ethan was oblivious to the storm brewing at his company. His focus was on the coalition and the families who relied on him. That evening, he visited Hannah at her apartment. She greeted him at the door, her face lighting up despite the fatigue that still lingered. "Ethan, come in," she said warmly, stepping aside. As they sat in the living room, Ethan explained the coalition's progress and the growing support from the community. "We're getting closer," he said, "but it's going to take everything we've got to push this through." Hannah reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "You've already done so much, Ethan, more than anyone else would have." Her touch lingered for a moment, sending an unfamiliar warmth through him. Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the connection that had grown between them. "Doing this has reminded me of what really matters," Ethan said softly. "And that's people, not profits or power, just people." The next morning, the world as Ethan knew it came crashing down. He arrived at Crowe Industries for what he believed was a routine meeting, but the atmosphere in the boardroom was tense. Victor sat at the head of the table, his smirk barely concealed. "Ethan," Victor began, his voice laced with false concern, "the board has reviewed your recent actions, and the numbers don't add up." He gestured to a series of charts and documents displayed on the screen. "These discrepancies suggest gross negligence. The shareholders are worried, and frankly, so is the board." Ethan's jaw tightened as he scanned the fabricated data. "This is a setup," he said coldly, his eyes locking on Victor. Victor spread his hands in mock innocence. "The numbers speak for themselves. The board has no choice but to call for a vote of no confidence." One by one, the hands around the table rose. The decision was unanimous. Ethan Crowe was officially removed as CEO. Victor didn't bother hiding his triumphant grin as Ethan left the boardroom. Reporters swarmed him at the building's entrance, their cameras flashing and questions flying. "Mr. Crowe, what do you say to the allegations? Do you deny the accusations of financial misconduct?" Ethan pushed through the crowd, his mind racing. His reputation, his career, and everything he had built were crumbling. But as he walked away from the chaos, a single thought cut through his despair. This isn't over. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the bakery. Maria and Carlos greeted him with concern, but he simply shook his head. "I need a place to regroup," he said quietly. Carlos led him to the upstairs office, where Marcus and Susan were already waiting. Ethan sat at the worn desk, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "What's the plan now?" Marcus asked. Ethan looked up, determination burning in his eyes. "We fight back. For the company, for this neighborhood, for everything Victor tried to destroy." The days following Ethan's removal as CEO were a blur of press conferences, rumors, and internal chaos at Crowe Industries. The media was relentless, casting him as the villain in a story he barely recognized. Each article seemed to twist the facts further, painting him as a reckless leader whose obsession with power had finally led to his downfall. Victor Chase had, in his own words, won the battle. But Ethan knew better than to stay down for long. What he hadn't counted on was the fire burning inside Ethan, something that had been reignited by Maya, by the people who had shown him a world outside boardrooms and stock prices. As the sun set over the city, Ethan found himself once again walking through the familiar streets of Brooklyn. His suit, once a symbol of corporate dominance, now felt like an uncomfortable weight. He had discarded the facade of the polished CEO, But the truth was, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He walked past the bakery, seeing Carlos and Maria working late into the evening. The warm light spilling from the windows made him pause, the smell of freshly baked bread pulling him inside. "You're still here?" Ethan asked, leaning against the doorframe. Maria looked up from her dough and smiled, though her eyes reflected a quiet concern. "I don't know if it's the right time to say this, Mr. Crowe, but I'm glad you're here. Not as a CEO, but as a person." Carlos, overhearing, nodded from the oven. "You've been doing good things for the community." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, surprised by their kindness. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It's more than enough," Maria said firmly. "You're trying, Ethan. That's all anyone can do." The simple affirmation, as small as it seemed, gave Ethan a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. The community, these people, had welcomed him not because of what he had built, but because of what he was trying to rebuild. The following morning, Ethan's phone buzzed as he poured himself a cup of coffee. It was a message from Susan. "We have a chance to turn this around. I have access to more of Victor's files. We can prove he doctored the numbers. But we need to act fast." Ethan's heart raced. This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. He wasn't just fighting for the company anymore. He was fighting for redemption, fighting for something far greater than personal success. He called Marcus immediately. "Get everything ready. I need to meet with Susan." That afternoon, in a nondescript conference room, Ethan, Susan, and Marcus sat around a table strewn with documents. Ethan's fingers drummed on the edge of the table, his mind racing through every strategy he had learned over the years. They had the evidence. Everything was in place, including the financial discrepancies and the emails between Victor and Pierce. "We need to present this at the next shareholder meeting," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "If we can expose Victor's manipulation in front of the board, it'll be game over for him." Susan's face was pale but determined. "I've been compiling the files. These aren't just a few false reports. It's a pattern of deliberate fraud. If we can show the board the full extent of his actions, there's no way they can ignore it." Ethan nodded. "We'll need allies. Not just from within the company, but from the community. They'll back us when they see what Victor's been doing." That evening, Ethan walked into the Thompsons' apartment, his mind still buzzing with plans and possibilities. Maya greeted him at the door, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Mr. Crowe, you're back," she said excitedly, tugging him toward the living room. Ethan smiled, but this time it wasn't just a polite gesture. It was genuine. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of belonging. Bookmark. Hannah joined them. Her smile was soft but warm. "You're making a difference," she said quietly. "I can see it." Ethan's eyes met hers. "I'm trying. But I need your help." Hannah raised an eyebrow, sensing the gravity of his words. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to need people who believe in this neighborhood. Not for profit, not for business, but for the people here, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you, all of you, have shown me what really matters." Maya climbed onto the couch next to him. "You're a good friend, Mr. Crowe. You're my hero." Her innocent words struck Ethan deeper than he could have imagined. He wasn't the hero. Maya was. She had shown him what it meant to care, to connect. "I'm going to make things right," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I promise." The next day, the meeting with the board was set. Ethan walked into the room, his heart pounding. The familiar faces of the board members greeted him with a mix of suspicion and silent judgment. Victor sat at the head of the table, his expression smug as always, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that Ethan hadn't noticed before. Ethan stepped to the front of the room, his gaze sweeping across the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and commanding, "I stand before you today, not just as the former CEO of Crowe Industries, but as a man who has discovered a deeply troubling truth." He motioned to the screen behind him, where the documents Susan had uncovered were displayed for all to see. "These are the original, unaltered financial reports, the ones that Victor Chase did not want you to see. These documents show a pattern of fraud, deliberate manipulation of data to destroy the integrity of this company." The room fell silent as the evidence was laid bare. Victor's face drained of color, but he stood, attempting to salvage the situation. "This is absurd," he spat. "Grayson is trying to undermine everything we've worked for." But Ethan wasn't finished. I've also been working with the people of this neighborhood, your neighborhood, the ones who are being pushed out for the sake of corporate greed. I've learned that success isn't just about numbers. It's about people. And that's something you've forgotten. The vote was swift. With irrefutable evidence and a compelling case, Ethan was reinstated as CEO. But this time, things would be different. Ethan knew that restoring the company's reputation was only part of the battle. The true victory lay in transforming Crowe Industries into a force for good, one that prioritized community, integrity, and compassion. As he stood at the front of the room, the applause of his employees filled his ears. But the true applause, the one that mattered most, came from a small bakery in Brooklyn, where Maya, Hannah, and the rest of the community had proven that the most important thing wasn't profit. It was the people who made it all worthwhile. The morning sun bathed the bustling streets of Brooklyn as Ethan Crowe walked through the neighborhood with a renewed sense of purpose. For weeks, he had been working tirelessly to repair the damage Victor Chase had done, both to Crowe Industries and to the community. But today, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Today marked the beginning of something new. Ethan stopped in front of the Thompson apartment, holding a box of pastries from the Ramirez bakery. He knocked, and moments later, Maya opened the door, her face lighting up as soon as she saw him. "Mr. Crowe, you brought cinnamon rolls," she exclaimed, pulling him inside with a tug on his hand. Hannah appeared in the kitchen doorway, her smile soft and welcoming. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her voice brighter than it had been weeks ago. Her health was improving steadily with the new treatments, and the color in her cheeks was a testament to her resilience. Ethan set the box on the kitchen table and pulled out a stack of papers. "I wanted to share something with you both," he said, spreading out the contents. Maya's eyes grew wide as she looked at the colorful drawings and architectural plans. "What is it?" she asked excitedly. "It's a park," Ethan explained, pointing to the sketches. "David Thompson Memorial Park. Named after your father, Maya. We're going to build it just a few blocks from here, in honor of his bravery and the way he always helped others." Hannah's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Ethan, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied gently. "Your father was a hero, and this community deserves to know his story. The park will have a plaque telling everyone about his courage. It will also be a place where kids can play, families can gather, and people can feel connected." Maya beamed, pointing at the sketches. "Look, Mommy, swings in a playground. It's going to be amazing." Hannah wiped away her tears, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Ethan, this means so much, not just to me and Maya, but to everyone here." Over the following weeks, the project gained momentum. Ethan collaborated with local leaders, including Councilwoman Patricia Lopez, to secure permits and funding. He also enlisted the help of the Brooklyn Bridge Business Coalition, whose members were eager to contribute. At the construction site, workers laid the foundation for the park, while Ethan met with volunteers to discuss the next phases. The park wasn't just a tribute to David, it was a symbol of hope for the entire neighborhood. One afternoon, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the site, watching as the first playground structures were installed. Maya stood beside him, her small hand clutching his. "Look at the slide," she exclaimed, her excitement contagious. Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't experienced in years. "Your dad would be proud of you, Maya," he said softly. She looked up at him, her brown eyes full of curiosity. "Why?" "Because you care about people." "Just like he did," Ethan replied. Maya grinned, then turned her attention back to the playground. "I can't wait to play here with all my friends." The transformation of the neighborhood wasn't confined to the park. Crowe Industries had begun implementing new initiatives under Ethan's leadership. A small business grant program helped shops like the Ramirez Bakery expand their operations, while partnerships with local organizations provided resources for youth programs and community events. One of the most significant changes was the creation of a legal aid clinic, spearheaded by Ethan's sister, Rebecca Crowe. After reconnecting with Ethan, Rebecca threw herself into the fight for justice, helping residents with housing disputes and legal issues. "This neighborhood has heart," Rebecca said one evening as she and Ethan reviewed plans for the clinic. It just needed someone to remind everyone how strong they are when they work together. Ethan nodded, his respect for his sister growing every day. I'm glad you're here, Rebecca. I couldn't have done this without you. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression warm. You've changed, Ethan. I see it. And I know Dad would have been proud of you. When the day of the park's grand opening arrived, the neighborhood was alive with anticipation. Families gathered at the entrance where colorful balloons and streamers swayed in the breeze. Maria and Carlos Ramirez had set up a booth offering their signature pastries while local musicians played lively tunes. Maya stood at the front of the crowd, wearing her favorite yellow dress and holding an oversized pair of scissors. She fidgeted with excitement as Ethan stepped up to the podium to address the gathering. Months ago, Ethan began, his voice carrying over the crowd. I was a man who measured success in dollars and deals. But this community, and one very special little girl, taught me that true success is about the lives we touch and the connections we make. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. David Thompson's legacy is a reminder of the power of compassion and selflessness. This park is dedicated to him and to every person who believes in building something greater than themselves. The crowd erupted into applause, and Ethan stepped aside as Maya stepped forward to cut the ribbon. With a triumphant snip, the gate swung open and children poured in, their laughter filling the air as they explored the new playground. Hannah stood nearby, tears streaming down her face as she watched Maya climb the jungle gym. Ethan joined her, his expression soft. It's everything I hoped it would be, he said. It's more than that, Hannah replied, her voice full of emotion. It's a new beginning. For all of us. As the sun set over the newly christened David Thompson Memorial Park, Ethan sat on a bench near the playground. Maya's laughter echoed across the park as she played with her friends, her joy uncontainable. Hannah sat beside him, their shoulders brushing as they watched the children. You've done so much for this community, Ethan, Hannah said softly. Ethan glanced at her, his heart full. I couldn't have done it without you. Without Maya. You reminded me of what matters. Hannah smiled, her hand finding his. And what's that? People, Ethan replied simply. Family, community. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Ethan knew that his life had finally taken on a meaning that no amount of wealth or power could ever replace. Months after the grand opening of David Thompson Memorial Park, the neighborhood had become a vibrant hub of activity. The park, with its colorful playground and shaded paths, was always bustling with families, children, and even elderly couples enjoying the fresh air. The bronze plaque at its entrance, honoring David's heroism, served as a daily reminder of the sacrifices made for others and the strength of the community. Ethan Crowe stood at the park's edge, leaning against a sturdy oak tree as he watched Maya run across the grass with her friends. She was laughing, her pigtails bouncing as she led the other children in a game of tag. The sound of her joy was infectious, and Ethan found himself smiling without realizing it. Hannah approached him, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him and settled onto the bench beside him. Her health had improved significantly since starting her treatments, and the brightness in her eyes was undeniable. Thank you, Ethan said, taking a sip of the coffee. For the coffee? She teased, her voice light. For everything, he replied earnestly. You and Maya showed me a world I didn't even know I was missing. Hannah looked at him, her expression soft. You've given so much back, Ethan. The park, the community programs, and even the business coalition. It's all made a difference. He glanced out at the park. The families chatting under the shade of the trees and the children racing each other on the playground. I used to think success was about climbing higher, earning more, and being the best, Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. But none of that ever felt real. This feels real. Hannah reached over, her hand brushing against his. It's because it is. You've helped people in ways that matter. At Crowe Industries, the changes Ethan implemented had begun to take root. The small business grant program continued to thrive, and the company's new direction, focused on sustainability and community investment, had garnered praise from employees and the media alike. For the first time in its history, Crowe Industries was recognized not just as a corporate powerhouse, but as a company that cared about its impact. Susan Dale had taken on her new role as Vice President of Corporate Social Responsibility with enthusiasm, overseeing projects that prioritized underserved communities. Marcus, now Chief Operating Officer, had streamlined internal operations to ensure efficiency without sacrificing the company's newfound values. In the heart of Brooklyn, Rebecca's legal aid clinic was thriving. Every Wednesday and Saturday, she and a team of volunteer lawyers assisted residents with housing disputes, contracts, and other legal issues. The clinic's impact was immediate, with families regaining stability and businesses securing fair leases. "We've helped over 50 families this month alone," Rebecca told Ethan one evening as they reviewed the clinic's latest reports. "And it's only the beginning." Ethan smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You're doing incredible work, Rebecca. Dad would have been proud of you." Rebecca looked at him, her expression warm. "He'd be proud of both of us, and of this community." One sunny afternoon, Ethan and Maya took a walk beneath the Brooklyn Bridge. Maya held his hand, her small fingers swinging their arms back and forth as she chattered about her school and friends. When they reached the spot where Ethan had collapsed months earlier, Maya stopped and looked up at him. "Mr. Crowe, do you remember this place?" Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting to the railing. The memory was vivid, how helpless he'd felt, how close he'd come to losing everything. "I'll never forget it," he said softly. Maya squeezed his hand. "Me neither. But it's okay because it's where we became friends." Her simple words struck Ethan with a quiet power. He knelt down so they were at eye level, his expression serious but full of warmth. "Maya, you didn't just save my life that day, you changed it. You reminded me of what's important." Maya smiled, her eyes shining. "Does that mean you'll always be my friend?" "Always," Ethan promised. Later that evening, Ethan joined Hannah and Maya for dinner in their cozy apartment. The smell of roasted vegetables and warm bread filled the small space, and the laughter around the table was easy and unforced. For Ethan, it was a far cry from the silent, lonely meals he used to have in his penthouse. As they cleared the table, Hannah paused, her hand resting on the back of a chair. "Ethan, I've been thinking," she began hesitantly. "You've become such an important part of our lives. And I think you belong here. With us." Ethan's heart swelled at her words. He looked at Hannah, then at Maya, who was grinning as she stacked plates. "I'd like that," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Months turned into seasons and the neighborhood continued to flourish. The park became the heart of the community, hosting festivals, picnics, and even a small farmer's market on weekends. Ethan often found himself there, whether it was to oversee a project or simply to enjoy the sight of children playing and families connecting. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan sat on a bench near the memorial plaque dedicated to David Thompson. He held a photo in his hands, a picture of himself and his father from years ago, taken during a baseball game. He traced the edges of the frame, his thoughts drifting to the lessons his father had tried to teach him about family and community. Hannah joined him, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the photo. "A reminder," Ethan said, "of what I almost lost, and what I've found again." Hannah smiled, slipping her hand into his. "It's a good reminder." Maya's voice rang out across the park, pulling their attention. She was at the top of the slide, waving enthusiastically. "Mr. Crowe, Mommy, look!" Ethan waved back, his smile genuine and full. "You know," he said to Hannah, "I never thought I'd find this. Belonging, purpose, it's more than I ever hoped for." Hannah squeezed his hand. "That's because you've built it. All of us have. Together." As the autumn breeze rustled the golden leaves overhead, Ethan felt a peace he'd never known before. For the first time, he understood the true measure of wealth. The connections he'd made, the lives he'd touched, and the family he'd found. And in the heart of Brooklyn, surrounded by the community he had grown to love, Ethan Crowe knew he was finally home. The story of Ethan Crowe and Maya Thompson is a testament to the transformative power of compassion and community. At its heart, it's a narrative about second chances, not just for Ethan, but for the people he touched along the way. Ethan's journey from a cold, isolated businessman to someone who embraced connection and purpose reminds us that true wealth isn't found in material success, but in the relationships we build and the lives we impact. Bookmark? Through Maya's innocent bravery, Hannah's unwavering strength, and the collective resilience of the neighborhood, Ethan was able to rediscover what truly mattered. Their story teaches us the importance of seeing beyond ourselves, valuing the people around us, and stepping outside our comfort zones to make a difference. It challenges us to reflect on our own lives and ask, are we building walls or bridges? Are we chasing fleeting gains or creating lasting legacies? This tale also highlights the ripple effect of kindness. A small act, Maya stopping to help Ethan, set off a chain of events that revitalized an entire community. It's a reminder that even the smallest actions can have profound impacts, and that hope often begins with a single step. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Did it inspire you? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And don't stop there. Share your own stories of courage, kindness, or transformation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the meaningful stories we have lined up for you. Together, let's celebrate the power of compassion and the beauty of human connection. We can't wait to hear your thoughts, so join the conversation and tell us what this story meant to you.